Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I want to thank you all for joining us again today. And I apologize if this is slightly repetitive because we had this introduction yesterday to kind of situate the book and our project, but I will be going over this again just for a quick recap for those of you who haven't joined. So this is our work in progress symposium, and we will be showcasing a forthcoming edited collection with Bristol University Press, tentatively entitled Beyond the Virus, Multidisciplinary and International Perspectives on Inequalities Raised by COVID-19. And this is edited by Adrienne, Yong, and I. And we are also very proud to be part of the Bristol Studies in Law and Social Justice series, led by Alan Bogg at Bristol University and Virginia Montevalu at UCL. So the idea of this edited collection came from a publication in 2022 that Adrienne and I wrote, a short reflection on COVID-19's effect on ethnic minority and migrant women and their barriers to accessing healthcare. This brought together both of our research expertise in medical law and bioethics and human rights and immigration. We were surprised and happy to see that we got a lot of attention for this short piece, including having it cited in the LSE Lancet Commission report on the NHS's response to COVID-19. So we thought we should do something a little bit bigger and reach out to other collaborators that have other areas of expertise that could speak to inequality. And this is how our project was born. So Adrienne and I are fully committed to diversity and inclusion, and we wanted to use this particular platform to showcase a wide variety of voices. And we are proud of the diversity we've achieved in this book, or we aim to achieve at least. As the title suggests, we draw upon different disciplines, including politics, sociology, and law, and from different countries around the world. The symposium is intended to be the first opportunity for our contributors to meet and for us to meet them sometimes because we haven't met and exchange ideas on a fast-moving and very topical area and to raise awareness around important issues relating to inequalities. So for practical reasons, the presentations are not, unfortunately, in the order that they appear in the book itself, but here is an overview to give you just a better idea of the structure. The first section of the book speaks to the manner in which the exercise of power and governance across the world has been seen to apply unequally during the pandemic. Two chapters consider the unequal effect of lockdown in the UK, one using a theoretical framework to analyze questions of liberty, the other examining the phenomenon using an empirical approach and qualitative methods. Power and governance is also examined more holistically in chapters on Israel and the province of Quebec in Canada, offering contrasting case studies. The second section of the collection considers inequalities related to one's gender and sexuality and the effect of the pandemic has had in worsening inequalities, with chapter examining the gendered effect of the pandemic on access to justice for women around the world, then looking more closely at public perceptions of female experts in the UK, gendered labor of women in higher education in Jordan, and the stigmatization of the LGBT community in South Korea. Finally, the book closes by considering the effects of the pandemic on marginalized community, with chapters looking holistically at ethnic minorities in the US and the UK, and then more specifically at prisoners in Brazil and migrants in Canada, as case studies of marginalized communities representative of both the global South and North. So I will leave it at this for now and hand over to Adrienne.
Thanks, Sabrina. We're very happy to have a couple of our contributors today for our morning panel. As Sabrina mentioned, due to the practicalities of time zones and availability, they're not necessarily in the themes of the book itself, but we hope that bringing these two papers together will actually have some coherence, as the whole book has in terms of inequalities anyway. So a bit of housekeeping. So I will keep time fairly strictly so we can get to our lunch break, which we would normally have in person, but everyone's just going to have to go back to their kitchens today and then return in an hour. Everybody will have 15 minutes and I will give you a 5-minute, quite rude Zoom interruption because there's no other way to do it. So I apologize in advance, and then a wrap up at the end. And then we'll have our discussants give their views for, let's say, approximately 10 minutes, and then hopefully open up to the floor for questions. And I think we're going to have a little bit of a change where there's a couple of changes in the program, and you can find the most up to date on the event page itself, which I'll put in the chat in just a minute. But I'd like to ask Julia and Valentina to kick off, and I will introduce them before they do. So we have, we're very happy to have Dr. Valentina Cardo and Dr. Julia Boelle. Valentina is an associate professor of politics and identity at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton. It's a great pleasure because Sabrina and I and a lot of the people in this group are indeed lawyers, and so we're happy to have the non-legal representation. She's a co-director of IPIC, the Intersectionality, Politics, Identities and Cultures Research Group, and is an expert on gender and politics, equality, identity and political communication. And with Valentina, we'll be presenting with Julia Boelle, a PhD graduate of Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Culture, with her research interests in the fields of disaster and crisis communications. And she's been involved in a project investigating the UK government's communication of pandemics and COVID-19. And that is what they will be speaking about today: inequality, expertise, and the COVID-19 crisis and intersectional analysis. Thank you very much. Valentina and Julia, please take it away.
Thanks, Adrienne. I will present for both of us. I've also started a timer just so that I don't get told off.
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me, actually.
That's all right. I'm going to share my screen. Also, can I just say, one of those massive flies have just landed in my study. So if I start waving my arms, that's why. I do apologize in advance. So I'm having the same problem that Sabrina was having with the speakers in the wrong place. No matter. Okay, so I'll be presenting for both Julia and myself today about this topic. I do want to say straight away that we're presenting very preliminary findings. So I do apologize in advance, but also this is a great opportunity to actually get some feedback, some questions, some useful stuff that we can use for the chapter. Okay. So now I can't see this because you're in the way. Okay, so we're looking at what we're interested in, looking at experts, and we're sort of at the moment defining experts in a kind of broad stroke way. So from health officials to politicians, and we're looking at the COVID crisis. We changed the dates a little bit, but we've settled on 1st of March 2020 to 31st of March 2021, which gives us just over a year. And we're particularly focusing on BAME women. Now, I just want to use, a word of warning. We're using, the term BAME, despite it being, we're aware that it's of course a controversial term. We're using it exactly the way that it's been used during the crisis, just as an umbrella term to highlight the health disparities during the crisis. So we're focusing on BAME women. So we're taking an intersectional approach, and we're interested in the kind of day government press conferences and their coverage in the media. We're looking at tabloids. We might add some national newspapers. I will tell you more when I get to the methods. And we are thinking about the ways in which BAME women were allowed to speak out or speak about the pandemic during this time. And the overall argument is that the presence or lack thereof of diverse voices in the public arena, gives us a sense of the kind of democracy we live in. So just to give you a little bit of background, of course, the idea that, we're starting from the, it's not even assumption, is sadly a certainty that there is an inequality for women and BAME voices in the public arena. We know that women and BAME voices, if this term is offensive to anybody, please tell me now so that I can stop using it. Otherwise, I shall continue to use it. All good? Thumbs up? Okay, thank you. So we know that there's an underrepresentation and a misrepresentation of women and BAME women and BAME people in the media. Worldwide, across time, it is very well recorded and very well talked about in the literature. We also know that there's an underrepresentation of these groups in expert roles and in politics, including politics and expert roles, but I think this comes down to our definition of experts. And of course, we know that ethnicity complicates this relationship. It's not just about gender, ethnicity complicates this relationship. And we also know that COVID has exacerbated it. I'm going to take you through very quickly the method we're using. We're looking at 156 press conferences or briefings. Obviously, they're not all daily, between 1st of March 2020 and 31st of March 2021. We're doing a very simple head count of women experts, BAME experts, who they are, who they speak for, who do they represent, what do they speak about? In brackets, what do they speak about? More in a minute. So we're doing a head count and we're looking at percentages. The second thing we're doing, do you see yourself on the side screen? You are. So if I close this, it's nice to talk to you because I can see you waving, but I'll close it for the benefit of the presentation. So the other thing we're doing is we're looking at newspapers and tabloids. What you see on your bottom left is what we're going by is the daily circulation. We're looking at the most read newspapers during the crisis. So we're doing a simple text analysis and we're looking for intersectional bias. And we are thinking about, when I said it was preliminary findings, is because we have been thinking about including a content analysis of press conferences themselves. So what the experts actually talk about. We're thinking about the kind of language used. We know that, for instance, the Prime Minister likes to use sport metaphors and kind of wartime militaristic language, which is often found to be used by male politicians and mainly male politicians doing this type during times of crisis, but also, or whether there is a kind of language of care that's being used more by BAME women. Every time I say BAME, I'm going to put it in brackets because obviously it's an intersectional analysis, but it's also looking at the specific characteristics separately. And we're also looking at the ethics of care through a feminist lens. I'm sure you know this, but the ethics of care has to do with the feminization of care. So the idea, the association that women do the caring roles, occupy the caring roles, and whereas men don't. So just to give you some preliminary findings, the first was the head count. So we looked at all these press conferences. We found that there were a total of 395 speakers, 81% were men, and 12% were BAME men, and of course 19% were women and 2% were BAME women, because obviously 395 speakers included speakers who came to speak multiple times. So if Matt Hancock did the press conference more than once. It was counted in the first set of data. So the second set of data looks at unique speakers. We see that 70% of these unique speakers were men, 15 were BAME men, and 30% were women, and 4% BAME women. We then looked at those leading the press conferences. So if you remember the picture, I mean, we've all seen it several times. There is a leading speaker in the middle, and then two speakers in support. So we looked at leading speakers. There was a total of 155 leading speakers, of which nearly 96% were men. That was wishful thinking on my part. And 10% were BAME men, and 4.5, nearly 5% were women, with 3% of BAME women. What we did find, though, is that there was sort of a reason why women came to lead these conferences. For instance, twice Priti Patel led the conference when the Prime Minister was sick, and once she led it 12 days after the Boris Johnson's address to the nation, which we thought was possibly part of the reason why she led it. Obviously, at this stage, we don't really have evidence for that, but we are thinking that is perhaps the case. Of the supporting speakers, so 155 of leading press briefing conference speakers, and 240 supporting speakers, of which 72% were men, 14% BAME men, and 28% women, with only 1.3% BAME women. So there were more women in support roles, but what we found is that they tended to be experts. They either held a doctorate or a title, and this is 64% of them, as opposed to nearly 38% of men. So men didn't seem to need to hold titles when they were in supporting roles. We looked at, I'm just going to present the Sun coverage here, just to give you a taste. I know I've got 5 minutes left. Adrienne, I can't see you, but I know I've got 5 minutes left.
Yes, I was going to interrupt you, so that's great.
That's fine. Okay, so we looked at the Sun. Somewhat pleasing to find was that there was not a huge amount of negative coverage referring to the person or her competences or lack thereof. But what we did find was a more nuanced, biased coverage of these BAME women. They were only occasionally referred to as experts, and here I'm defining them as top government scientists or senior politicians. These were the terms used when they were sort of framed as experts. They were usually positioned in the articles in supportive rather than main roles. So they were described as standing or appearing next to. They were also often mentioned towards the end of the article. We know by the inverted pyramid of journalism, this is a problem because the key arguments tend to come at the beginning. Sorry, not arguments, but the main news tend to come at the beginning, and then the less important ones tend to come at the end of the article. They were discussed as adding to rather than providing key information. We also found that they were often delivering warnings and often through dramatic language. So, the crooks who were selling bogus protective gear, and appeal to guilt. So, for instance, for not following the rules. And often the Sun, at least, praised these BAME women experts for doing so. So there were, praise for these senior politicians recognizing the human cost of the restraints shown by the vast majority of Britons. There was also some evidence of emotional language of care, again, in the article. So talking emotionally about the ways in which women refer to care roles, etc. but there was a very rare acknowledgement of the fact that these women were mostly not there. BAME women were mostly not there. This has a question mark to it. As we said, we were not entirely sure whether we're going to look at the content of press conferences, but a preliminary finding kind of indicates that we might have to, because there's evidence to the fact that BAME women were usually asked to deliver information about domestic abuse, child abuse, dating advice, vulnerability around fraud, and nurses and NHS difficulties within these COVID briefings. Now we know, so this is just preliminary conclusions, we know that BAME women are greatly underrepresented in government, and of course, you know, the fact that they are underrepresented in these brief conferences is a confirmation of that. And they're also underrepresented in position of leadership. But what we did find is that there seems to be an inability or an unwillingness to include these women, or to include BAME women who can, you know, knowledgeably speak about the crisis. Those who took part, not in leading positions, in the press conferences, held titles, whereas men did not need to hold these titles to be in supportive positions. The representation of these groups in the media showed some evidence of gender coverage, although we haven't had much time to look at other types of bias, but this we think may indicate that there seems to be a kind of acceptability in using gender bias in reporting about these groups, whereas race bias is perhaps not seen as such a problem. My last point, with 4 seconds to share, the lack of BAME women experts during the pandemic at a time when we really relied on information to know what was happening, was that under a misrepresentation in news media obviously has consequences for the way we see ourselves as represented. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Valentina.
Over. I do apologize.
No, not at all. No, not to worry. Thank you so much for keeping to a good time. We very much appreciate it. And I suppose the only thing left is to go to the next presentation. So we have Dr. Jo Tomlinson and Dr. Jed Meers representing the larger group of researchers, an interdisciplinary group of researchers from the University of York. Dr. Jo Tomlinson is a senior lecturer in public law at the University of York and the research director at the Public Law Project, which is a legal charity that advances access to public law remedies for the poor and disadvantaged. And he is an expert in the interplay between public law, public policy, and government systems. And with him is Dr. Jed Meers, a lecturer in law at the University of York, who is an expert in public law and socio-legal studies, social welfare law, amongst other things. But the most important thing is that they are both part of the Law and Compliance During COVID-19 research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And I believe that they have been collating data from the beginning of lockdown last year, but they will explain more. And today, Jo and Jed will speak a bit about women, if I understand correctly. And that feeds in very nicely to Valentina and Julia's presentation. So please do feel free to take it away. Thank you, Jo and Jed.
Thanks very much. And it's really great to be speaking at a conference, but also contributing such an exciting collection as well. Really interesting papers. So as you just said, the paper we're presenting today is part of a much broader project on law and compliance. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the broader project at the start of the presentation. And it was also said there's lots of other people involved in this. Naomi Finch really wanted to be here today to present her work on this, but had a scheduling conflict. So we're probably going to try and do our best to make up for Naomi's absence, but yeah, we'll do our best. So the headline that we want to give for this presentation is that essentially legal compliance can be viewed as it traditionally is in socio-legal literature as something that's about social psychology, and we can think about models of why people comply with different rules, but it's really important to factor equalities dimensions into that. So the experience of complying with lockdown regulations is different for people with different protected characteristics, and intersectionality also plays into that a little bit. So whilst we're going to focus on women in this presentation, because we found some really interesting data on compliance behaviours around women, the paper is going to be much broader. So this is essentially a way into the discussion about barriers that certain groups face to comply with lockdown rules. So I'm going to start with the overview of the project. I'm going to look at our findings around gender and then talk about barriers to compliance. I should also mention I'm not controlling the slides. I'm doing a bit of a Chris Whitty, so Jed is going to be.
That may be apparent from my cock up there.
So I'm slightly out of step, that's why. Yes, let's start with the project. Next slide, please, Jed. So at the start of the pandemic, the project team got together and started to think about what interesting things around law society we could study during this period. So some of the things that jumped out to us about what was happening in public law and legal system then was there was a huge amount of legal change that was happening, all these rules being introduced. We knew they were going to be changed, evolved very quickly. That's not particularly unusual. This happened as Brexit was also happening, where there was tons and tons of quick legal change going on. But what was really unusual about that moment was how those quick and significant change, impacted on the day-to-day life of everybody in the population. So it gave us an opportunity to study everyday behaviours in relation to law in a way that's quite unusual. There was also this sense in which rights were interfered with as well. So this idea of trying to get a sense of what everyday perception of rights are when laws are biting on your kind of individual day-to-day activities. So the central question at the heart of the project, the wider project we're doing, is really simply, why do people obey rules, and why do people obey legal rules in particular? What drives people to behave in relation to rules in certain ways? So we are hoping to get out of this various things. One is just to suggest a few of the potential benefits of doing this work. One is to find new ways of thinking about the legal or rule-based components of public health responses, which I think we've all seen is a really important part of public health responses, and maybe we've not necessarily mastered that as well as we could have done. There's a really interesting Constitution Committee report out on that very topic today, and some of the problems around the way we've managed rules and compliance during the pandemic. There's also potential here to take this experience and think about how it applies more generally to any area of public policy where compliance is really important, or legal compliance is really important. And also, as I mentioned earlier, try to develop a sense of how people are actually perceiving their rights in contemporary society. Often the conversation we have about rights in law is quite, I don't mean this is necessarily a critical way, but quite an elitist conversation about law and judgments and legislation, but how people actually perceive their rights and how that interacts with their behaviour is something we could do a lot more to understand. So it seemed like a good opportunity to try to do that work. So just to very quickly sketch out the data that we've been collecting. So we did a series of national quantitative surveys. So we did one at the start of lockdown, we did one a short while into lockdown, and then we did one later that focused particularly on face coverings. So the first two in particular are quite large surveys, talking about 60 questions, asking about all kinds of background assumptions, perceptions on the rules, understanding of the rules. Those questions were built out of concerns that are raised in the theory that we already have on legal compliance. So we're trying to understand how far that existing theory is, well, how far is it relevant to this situation? Do we need to refine it, extend it, etc.? That quantitative data set we've supplemented with a stack of qualitative work. So we did online focus groups. We had 100 participants recruited. We had a very diverse sample recruited by Facebook, and we got tons and tons of online focus group data by providing interventions where we asked the focus group respondents to respond to them. And I think Jez will attest, we've got some quite lively activity on the online focus groups when we try to provoke them about various bits of COVID regulations. And within that group, we conducted 47 more in-depth qualitative interviews with members of those focus groups. So I'm going to pass over to Jed at this point, but this is the point we're going to pick up here is essentially that it's really important to factor in demographic and positionality concerns into the analysis of compliance behaviour, and that's something that's often been a little bit neglected in that area of research. So, Jed.
Brilliant, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so just to pick up on what Joe was saying, what we mean by equalities analysis here really is, I guess, a subset of other issues we're exploring within that broader data set. And really for this presentation, sort of a subset of findings that Naomi had come across within our quantitative analysis of compliance that we're trying to explain with a qualitative data set. So a lot of the stuff that Valentina was talking about, you know, COVID touted as this great equalizer. We know that's not the case across a whole set of pre-existing inequalities. So we're zooming into just one for the purposes of this presentation. So just to contextualize this a little bit, as Joe was saying, our quantitative data and the project as a whole really comes at this from the question of compliance. When we look at gender and compliance and current writing on this in relation to the pandemic, the sort of default position, if you like, the standard position within the literature is, and I've put Galasso up on the screen there just because that's been quite an influential study and was very large scale. It was across 8 OECD countries and a panel of about 20,000 participants or so. Effectively finds that women are more likely to perceive COVID-19 as a serious health problem, to agree with restraining public policy measures to a greater extent than men, and are more compliant. That's the general position within the literature, and there's been some subsequent studies along those lines as well. Not everyone says that, but it's a significant consensus that emerged within studies on compliance. Within our quantitative work that Naomi's been looking at, we took quite a different approach to these pre-existing studies in a couple of ways. The first is we differentiated between individual restrictions. So we weren't looking at general measures of compliance, we were asking about specific behaviours. And we also adopted a subjective definition of compliance. So what mattered was what people thought were unlawful. Or thought were against the guidance, or thought were allowed, and so on. And I think, Joe, the report that's out this morning that Joe was just talking about from the House of Lords Constitution Committee, there's a little bit in there about, you know, most people thinking the 2 metre distancing, for instance, was a legal requirement, was not something that was just guidance. So what we've found from that slightly different approach is something quite different and something a bit more complex, perhaps, in the reality of the lived experiences of all these people facing these restrictions. The first is that women were approximately twice as likely to men to break a rule they thought was illegal after you control for some other factors like household size, whether you have a garden and so on. And 40% of women broke a rule they thought was illegal compared to 32.5% of men. And that was a statistically significant difference in the models we've got currently. So that's quite a different finding. When we then begin to look at the individual restrictions and start to break these down, we found that once controlling for other factors, women were 80% more likely than men, so 1.8 times more likely to meet family and friends inside their home if they thought this was illegal. But women were not more likely than men to break the 2 metre rule, or the outside rules as we've sort of badged them. So 2 metre distancing, households meeting outside, that sort of thing. So it suggests that there may be something happening here with how the regulations are impacting differently on men and women that's quite different to some of the other findings that have come out in compliance in this area. I should probably say this is based on the second wave of analysis, which was that about June, Joe, from memory? I might have got maybe slightly earlier than that. So not straight after lockdown, a little bit in once the regulations are properly bedded in. So the way we've started to think about this is looking into our qualitative data set that Joe was outlining earlier to see if we can find some possible explanations. And Jackie Gullen's work up at Edinburgh, I don't know if people have come across this paper, has been particularly influential for us when thinking about the gendered impact of these restrictions. And what Gullen argues, alongside other things, is that there's particular concepts within the regulations, so particularly households and childcare that she outlines, that exacerbate existing inequalities for women in particular. So what I'll do now is just, I know we've only got 5 minutes or so left, and given Valentina didn't run over time, I'm determined that we won't either. So I've done the thing where you're drawing on qualitative data, where you just throw loads of really long quotes in, particularly for the works in progress. So I probably won't get a chance to go through all of these. But what we've tried to identify within the regulations are reasons as to why this might be, why this differential is happening. And I think we've come across 4 perhaps so far within the qualitative data. I should say we've conceptualized these as barriers to compliance. That might not be the right way of thinking about them, because when we, in our broader work on compliance, we find people tend to adopt almost like a finely textured proportionality analysis. They're weighing up the risks, they're thinking about the aims of the regulations, they think about their understanding, and then come to an overall position. But I think for the purposes of this, we're calling them barriers. So just to give you a flavour of these, I think the first is assumptions about the definition of childcare. within the regulations and how people are understanding those distinctions. So, for instance, the exemptions for childcare arrangements were broadly parallel to the Childcare Act 2006. It's quite a formalised idea about what childcare is. And what we find within our data is that these arrangements are far more complicated than that. This is a quote from a grandparent who was looking after her daughter's children before the bubble policy came in a little bit later. And effectively, her daughter was a key worker. So she's saying she's a key worker, her husband is a builder, she's got 4 children. Now, I used to have a youngest 2.5-year-old every week, childminding. When lockdown came on and you couldn't see your grandchildren, but if I had childminder above my head, I could look after a child. Makes no sense to me, that at all. And then she took over childcare again before the policy came in. And to be fair, we didn't do it for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, because it was affecting her. Her daughter was a key worker and she was having to do nights and stuff like that when her husband was supposed to leave early in the morning. He had to wait for her to come home. So there's clearly an arrangement here where they are breaching the restrictions and their understanding of the restrictions, but in a way which they feel like is necessary to avoid the impact on the daughter. And that's part of the consequences of this definition of childcare within the regulations. I'll just skip over this next quote in the interests of time. The second possible barrier we've identified is this closed definition of household. And Gulen writes in that the piece we were just talking about the interdependency between households and the independency of human life. Households are conceptualized in such a way under the regulations where they're quite narrow and self-sustaining entities. And that's not the case. There's a lot of indeterminacy that's coming up within the sample. So as an example of that, we've got here a mother who looks after kids every now and then. So, I mean, normally it's a very reciprocal arrangement. So Bosenberry's mother sometimes looks after her children. I do all the organising, paying her bills, fixing everything that breaks, finding everything that she can't find in the shops. So I do the sort of maintenance and running around for her, but she does a lot of childcare for me. She rents out properties and I have to go and deal with a tenant or something. I can drop the kiddies off with her. Then I've got a few hours to sort that out. Or, you know, for the school run, she'll quite often do school runs if I've got a appointment somewhere. And what she goes on to say is that routine of caring for her mother, who's quite an elderly person, not having that routine has then had implications on her as well. So it's been a reciprocal arrangement. And she's particularly concerned that going forward, she's not going to be able to do the same caring role that she has done before because of the impact of the lockdown and not having that caring routine with her. So just the final two, the compounding of caring obligations is another thing we've had. And what we really mean by this is caring responsibilities people have already had becoming more acute, or people who are not working as a result of caring responsibilities being asked by others to take on further caring responsibilities that may be in breach of the restrictions. So to give you an example of the latter here, this is another one of our participants who was currently off work caring for her own children and was asked by a neighbour effectively to look after their kids as well. And she explains this towards the end. She says, the one thing I haven't told you about throughout is, if I'm being honest, I don't feel like you're the police, is when on Wednesday a baby comes here. And they go on to explain that parents of their friends or friends of the husband, it's their child. And because they've got what she describes as sort of powered type jobs, very full on jobs, they were happy to take the child as they were caring for their own children as well. She then goes on to talk about how she was only doing that if the grandchild of those children were happy to do so, because she felt like that was the person most at risk. But given I've got 20 seconds left, I will just skip to the final one to outline, which is the welfare of dependents. And one thing that came up within the sample, particularly for people who are parents of very young children, is real concern that continued compliance with restrictions would have a disproportionate effect on the welfare of dependents. So the example I've put up on the screen here is one of our participants who has a very young baby, and she was thinking, well, for her, there's a real risk that the baby is becoming more frightened of other people, very, very attached to me, and that's a real problem, when the risk to the actual baby of COVID-19 is very, very small, and it's what she described as a theoretical problem. And she goes on to say, I think there would come a point where it tips over and the damage being done by following restrictions would be outweighed by the damage being done to a child of not following them. Sorry to skirt through the quotes really, really quickly there. I overquoted it, given for 15 minutes, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of the sort of barriers we're thinking about trying to explain some of those findings that Naomi's come across within the quantitative data. I'm obliged to put the website up on the screen, so there is more information about the broader project that Joe is outlining and some of the findings there as well, if anyone wants to look at them. Great, thanks. Sorry, that was slightly over 15 minutes as well. I think of it.
Not 16. At all. No, that's fine. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to put it in the chat as well so people can click the link easily, please feel free. We just want to highlight, or I'd just want to highlight that, yes, this is a big group of 5 people, interdisciplinary. Naomi Finch is the lecturer in social policy. We also have Professor Simon Halliday in the law school and Dr. Mark Wilberforce in the social policy research unit, all at the University of York, alongside Jed and Joe, just to give everybody their dues, as we did actually yesterday with a big group of the Canadians as well. So thank you so much. We will now move to hearing from our 2 discussants, Professor Joe Littler and Dr. Maartje Visser. I will introduce both of you guys and then have you both speak for, let's say, about 10 minutes, and then have Valentina, Julia, Jed, and Joe respond, if that's okay, and then we'll open it up to the floor for other questions. So if I can start with Joe, Professor Joe Littler, in order of the presentations as well, because we've asked Joe to focus on Valentina and Julia's, and then Maartje to focus on Jed and Joe's. But actually, please do feel free to go broader, depending on what you've heard. We're very happy to hear all comments. Joe Littler is a professor in the Department of Sociology and the director of the Gender and Sexualities Research Centre at City University of London. Sabrina and I are proud to be the newest organising committee members of the GSRC and work with Joe. She works on culture, society, inequality, and power. And this also includes meritocracy, neoliberal narratives, consumerism, social reproduction, and cultural politics. And this makes her a perfect discussant, we think, for Valentina and Julia's paper. But of course, as I said, because there's so much synergy between Joe and Jed and Valentina and Julia's presentations, feel free to comment on everything. Joe, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much. They were so interesting. I've got so many questions, and I do have questions for all of you. So hope that's okay. So I guess I'll start with the last presentation first. I thought it's very interesting how you're asking, you know, the bigger questions about compliance, as in compliance to what and why. And to me, that what kind of first stood out was that to the extent to which this is an issue around the kind of the government's marginalization of care and not, you know, the government's not recognizing the extent of social reproduction, which has been quite widely acknowledged in some ways. But you can think, for example, about how they didn't put the onus on employers to furlough people who had kids. This is true in the university sector as anywhere else. And it wasn't possible to be furloughed part-time during the pandemic. So those kind of policies like that really hit women with kids in particular during the pandemic. And I'm interested to what extent you think that might be, you know, kind of a driving factor to some of these issues around rule breaking, which are, you know, because the rules didn't make it possible to, you know, to kind of do the work of social reproduction, to, you know, to replace the networks of care which were in place. So I think that's perhaps a kind of issue that could be talked about. Yeah, and then Valentina and Julia, I thought, yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, one question I had initially was, to what extent is this about women in the Tory party? Yeah, because you're talking about the public, oh, brain's died, but you know, the public pronouncements that the Tory party are making on a regular basis. And I think it's quite interesting then, because when you're talking about the news coverage of that, I mean, in a way, does it come down to the news coverage of Priti Patel? You know, and would, for example, the news coverage by the Sun of the Mail or the Telegraph to someone like Zara Sultana be very different? You know, to what extent is it about the politics of what Priti Patel is saying? So I thought, you know, it might be interesting. There's always the potential always to widen everyone's research all the time, but you know, maybe to look at the coverage of BAME female politicians more broadly by those right-wing tabloids in particular, which sell the most in our country, because that might be quite interesting. And the other thing I thought was, I wondered whether you come across the Expert Women Project. which well, for those people that don't know, it was set up in about 2013, I think, by female media professionals who work at City, including Liz Howes. And they do surveys counting the number of women authority figures across 6 flagship media news programmes. And they're still doing that at the moment. And I had a quick look on their website while you were talking, and I thought it's kind of interesting to connect to, because they found that the number of female experts during the pandemic went down, and that March was the lowest since 2013 on the Today programme, for example. So I thought, is there scope perhaps for your project to connect to them and to, to offer a more kind of fine-grained BAME analysis of experts in that way? And then I guess for all the speakers, I'm also wondering how are all these issues of lack of representation and inequality that are to do with gender, how do they relate to the kind of wider expectations and lack of policy in place in this country around sharing childcare? Because that's going to hit. It hits rule breaking, and it hits the number of expert women, for example, falling on the Today programme. So, for example, you could think about the recent reports that have come out from the TUC around how shared parental leave is only taken up by 2% in 2% of cases. So we have quite an ineffective paternity, maternity policy at the moment. So to what extent are these bigger public policy questions around gender and inequality shaping what you found?
Thanks very much, Jo. I would, if there's no objections, I'll hand over to Dr. Maartje Visser to give us her views on, well, we've asked her to look at Jo and Jed's presentation, but again, if you feel free to go broader than that. Maartje is an associate professor of law at the Yong Peng Hao School of Law at the Singapore Management University, SMU. She is an expert around 2 broad themes: constitutional engagement by the courts and non-judicial actors, and the transnational judicial dialogues and networking, with an interest as well in global constitutional norms at the national level, as well as a comparative pedagogy and methodology. And Maartje, we would love to hear from you about what you thought.
Thank you so much for having me. So as you may be able to tell, I'm not based in the UK. I don't research in the UK, but I do read The Guardian on a daily basis. So I feel somewhat equipped to comment on the 2 presentations. So like what Jo has just said, I think there are a lot of synergies, and I think that there is a lot of scope to, if you want, expand these 2 projects. And I know in the case of Jo and Jed, that clearly is already the intention. So perhaps let me try and make a few comments based on what was said during the presentation. And then for Jo and Jed, also add something based on the abstract. So I think if we first look at the topics that you touched upon, and in particular, some of the barriers to compliance that might exist for women, I wonder to what extent there also is a question here of identity at stake. And that's actually something that I could potentially see as cutting across to both presentations. That both in the initial default framing as women are likely to be compliant, they see it as a serious health problem. In a way, it almost confirms that assessment of the identity of the woman is as the mothering, the caring being who obviously will take a, will be alarmed by anything that could endanger those that she looks after the most, etc. And I think that might provide almost an additional explanation to compliance issues. Because what you could get is either a sense of conflict between the societal impressions of identity and at times the woman's own sense of identity. Who really are my responsibilities? Do I only see myself as a mother or a carer, or as a working professional? And that I think came out quite nicely in a number of the quotes that you put on the slide. And then if you look closely at the type of infractions, like the breaches that were committed by women, what I found striking, and again, I'm just basing myself on what you were able to share during, and I know it's a short period of time, is that in a way, the size of the impact seems minor. And the individuals that are affected by the infraction all have given consent, or at least the adults in question all have given consent. We want the child to come over. We want the grandparent, the grandmother to have a say in this. So there's a sense of familiarity and a sense that society as a whole is not placed in jeopardy in the way you would with, say, the 2-meter distance rule, because by then you're talking about a potentially random stranger. So that might almost go to, and here I thought from a legal perspective, do women perhaps see themselves as complying, maybe not with the letter, but with the spirit of the law? So that's if you want what I found most striking from the presentation. Then for the abstract, and that perhaps might be useful in the wider project, I wonder whether in addition to the markers that you've already looked at, you're also able to distill something about the individual's socioeconomic status, relationship status, and residency status when tracing issues of compliance and the way that people have been affected by COVID. So I can imagine, again, if your socioeconomic status is insecure, as it tends to be for women more often than it tends to be for men, and in particular for minority women, then you might feel that greater sense of need or urgency or justification to get away with small infractions. Similarly, if you're in a relationship, then that changes the setting as compared to being, a single who's living at home and might perhaps be the most productive, as they've ever been. And then, and this is perhaps for a longer term project, the kind of method that you've used, so that quantitative plus that qualitative sampling, I would be very interested to see whether this yields any evidence of systemic or more structural biases that we would not be aware of, and that might have been amplified by COVID, but pre-existed. Now then, if I quickly turn to Valentina's presentation. So again, this is fascinating. I wondered here whether your results show any changes over time in the extent to which women were featured. Because I think that would be interesting as well. So is there a correction, or is it we started with a certain approach, and since we seem to be able to almost get away with it, it's accepted, there is no sense of urgency to change this? And that leads me to the other question. So at some point you said, well, it's no longer acceptable to engage in overt race bias. And we haven't seemed to have reached that point yet when it comes to gender. And I wonder whether it's only a question of acceptability or whether it's a question of awareness, that it's a blind spot, that we need someone, basically you and the kind of research that you do, to point out, have you realized that women and, for instance, and minorities have been underrepresented? Because for race, we have that salience. And at times I wonder whether we've gotten there when it comes to gender as well. Now, and then I could see a potential link between both. What I wondered was this: would women, or if you want, other individuals, be more likely to comply if the public officials in charge of communicating the policy were relatable, so they would share the identity? Because I'll speak here. So I've lived through 2 lockdowns with 2 small children. So I literally feel the pain experienced by a number of these, like the candidates that you've interviewed. If I see a 65-year-old single man, or someone who has grown children or has a wife who just does all the mothering, I'm thinking, yeah, that's easy for you to say. If I would see a woman who says, look, I know what I'm asking is hard. I too have small children at home. I know it's difficult. I wonder whether, so my suspicion is that might have an effect on compliance as well. And that might be perhaps an interesting link between 2 of the projects. I've probably spoken far too much, but that's a testament as to how completely interesting both presentations are. So Adrienne, back to you.
Not at all. Thank you so much. We appreciate all interventions and questions. I would like to ask anybody in the audience now to feel free to put your hands up or put your questions in the chat, and we can read them out for you. But before we do that, I would like to give Valentina, Julia, Jed, and Joe a chance to respond to the discussants' points, and then we can have we'll take questions from the audience. I have a couple if nobody wants to bite, but perhaps we can go Valentina and Julia first.
Thanks, Adrienne. So many really interesting, good questions and points raised. Just on the last one, Maartje, it's interesting to look at, for instance, New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern's case. A new mother with a little child. I don't know whether compliance would have changed there, but certainly just to link up to one of Joe's point, my sense is that none of this functions in a vacuum. So I think the policy is directly related to behavior, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of terms, Jed and Joe, but it seems to me that there is a direct relationship between policy behavior, media representation, actual representation, in body, in the case of the press conferences. The other thing that I wanted to just quickly give an answer was it a coverage of the Tory party? No, it wasn't. We looked at women in the Tory party. We did look at other, very few, as you saw, women who did Priti Patel was basically one of the only BAME women there, but there were others. Jenny
Harris.
Thank you. Julia knows the data much better than I do. And these, these instances came up for them as well. And I don't know whether, Julia, you found that.
Actually, if I could add something to this, because
please.
The thing is, so you mentioned Priti Patel, and she's obviously a Tory, so coverage might vary for her representation, but at the same time, she was only covered, I believe, 5 times out of the 75 times of women's representations that we found. And all the other women are, for example, the head of Test and Trace, the medical director of NHS England, the medical director for primary care. So my impression that they were basically mentioned in the press conference or invited to be in the press conferences because of their professional standing rather than actually party membership. Although it might perhaps be interesting to actually look whether they are officially associated with specific parties. But overall, that would be my impression in terms of party membership, that the focus is more on expertise rather than political aligning.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. I mean, I guess it would be interesting to look at affiliation, wouldn't it? Because in some cases it correlates and some it doesn't. I don't think I've been watching enough press conferences.
Oh, we watch so many.
Yeah.
I think we'll probably leave it to Jed and Joe to respond.
Yep. Please go ahead. Yeah, Jed and Joe.
Kick us off, Joe.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, great. So feel free to put in. So they were really helpful comments. So just to echo Valentina as well, thanks so much. And we'll pass those on to the other chapter authors as well. I think there's a few points, Joe, then I'll hand over if there's anything else you want to add with it. I think firstly, this question of representation and public communications is really interesting for us. We asked all of our participants about the press conferences. And it'd be interesting. I'll send you an email after this, Valentina and Julia. We did have one participant who watched them all. When we interviewed them in August, it was anyway. But the thing that was really interesting, I think this comes back to what Maartje was saying about this spirit issue, spirit of regulations, is how much the messaging moved to talking about common sense and about approaching the regulations in a common sense way. And there has been a little bit of work I've seen on this already in current sociology about sort of social representations of common sense knowledge, producing scientific knowledge into common sense knowledge. But of course, I think that's probably one of the reasons why representation in public communications is so important, because Boris Johnson's common knowledge is not like anyone else's common knowledge. And what on earth does a common sense approach to these regulations look like? And I think one area, I think me and Joe, you might have seen us both light up when you were talking about spirit against sort of spirit in the letter. That's an area we're working on at the moment, drawing particularly on sort of techniques of neutralization theory. The problem we've got is, of course, when you ask people to justify non-compliance, it's slightly different to their reasoning as to why they do and don't comply. So it's always a slightly different component of the project, but that's something we're definitely picking up on, and I think it feeds in to a lot of this talk about public representation that Valentina and Julia were talking about. On the marginalisation of care and the complexity of networks of care, I think there are two issues that come up, particularly within the qualitative data, which we just haven't had time to deal with. One is the huge issue of homeschooling and the implications of homeschooling, particularly for those who weren't key workers but were still working, and those who are maybe on the margins of key worker status, particularly within the first wave. And the other issue is size of families, and particularly large families and where there's intergenerational living at play, sometimes not necessarily within the same property. So it all comes back to this idea of households. But I think the honest answer, Joe, from me and Joe would be we haven't properly thought through the engagement with that literature yet. And that's something that we're going to have to think about very carefully, because I think you're absolutely right that it does help to explain a lot of what we're trying to talk about in terms of barriers. I think the final point, just to say in response, in terms of other factors about socioeconomic status, other things like that, insofar as the quantitative work's concerned, the figures we were presenting, we'd controlled for quite a few different things like key worker status, size of property, socioeconomic factors, extent of overcrowding, other things that we thought might impact on that. The qualitative work, really all we're doing in the context of this paper is providing illustrations of things that we think might help to explain some of the quant findings. So that's a little bit sketchy. We have tried to make that sample as representative as we can, and we've got a decent demographic range, but we certainly can't say as much as we might like to from the qualitative data. So yeah, Joe.
Just to add to a few of those points, they agree with. On the kind of representation of people at the press conferences, I think a really important point. One of the issues we've got with this project, to be really blunt about it, is the data set is so massive and there's so many ways into this issue that initially when we started, we're going to write a paper on legal compliance, and we have a table of about 15 potential different angles, and I'm sure there's many more. And it's something that we'll be looking to do in the future, open up the data set so that people can come to it and use it and make most of it from, for their own purposes. But one of the other areas we're looking at is it's being led by another one of the team, Simon Halliday, this idea of policy procedural justice. So the idea that in legal compliance studies, procedural justice is quite central theory, the idea that if certain characteristics of the relationship between authority and individual are kind of present, you're going to increase legitimacy and compliance. Now that's usually been studied at an interpersonal level, so police officer person kind of interaction, for instance. The idea we're looking at is, does that same thing apply at a general policymaking level as well? So do things like voice, for instance, factors such as being able to be listened to, does that apply to perceptions of policy fairness? And so I guess the main point on that is it's not just potentially, and we're not quite there on the analysis yet, it's not just necessarily who's that represented in the press conferences, but who people perceive are being listened to by those people at the press conferences as well, which I think is quite an interesting element. Yeah, I guess the other point, which is a relatively straightforward point, is a big part of this project has been sort of engaging with policymakers to try to make them see the different, more nuanced aspects of this. An answer I get quite a lot on the kind of drafting of the various regulations is that they needed to be done urgently. So there wasn't time to think through nuance in a great deal. I think that's not necessarily, obviously there was a degree of urgency. I think it's a weak argument in lots of places. We were in this situation for quite a long time. The rules were changed quite regularly. They could have been updated and often were. But there's a really excellent piece by Tom Hickman about the relaxation of the first lockdown in England, which is called a very English lockdown. He said even though you saw these kind of quite generalized rules being restricted, that the things that were being prioritized that people could do, like play golf, for instance. That was one of the first things that people could do. There were certainly priorities operating behind these legal changes. Yeah, just to say that I'm skeptical of that urgency argument that I hear quite a lot from the people involved in this world.
Thanks very much to all speakers. I think that a lot of really valuable discussion has come out, and we're very happy to hear from the floor. I think Tammy has put her hand up first, Professor Tammy Harvey, who's recently joined City as a professor. I think yes, you can turn yourself on. Hi, Tammy. Yes, please go ahead. We'd love to hear from you. And then I'll take Sabrina's questions and then open it up to everybody.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask questions, and thank you for two really rich papers. I also didn't get a chance to say how good the papers were yesterday, so I'll quickly say that as well. I mean, I have a couple of questions, and they're sort of the same question for each paper, really. And I guess maybe this question is a function of the fact that you only had 15 minutes to speak, and I haven't seen the written versions of your papers, and also the stage that the project is at. But for both of the papers, I have questions that have to do with what kind of a paper is it? So for Valentina and Julia's paper, I was really struggling to hear your narrative for the paper. You have fabulous, wonderful data, which is so rich and so important. And you have really a number of possible really interesting theoretical frames from different disciplines. But I was really struggling to hear, what is it that you're trying to argue in this paper? Is it an explanatory narrative? Are you trying to explain what happened? You know, for instance, that people who were already intersectionally excluded became further excluded by COVID. Is that the narrative, or is the narrative something different to that? So that was my kind of big question for your paper. The other not question but provocation that I have for you, and this has to do with the things that I've been reading and thinking about recently, is I wondered whether there was an element of epistemic injustice going on in what you're seeing. So the women on whom you focus are excluded in their capacity as knowers, as people whose testimonies are excluded from the public discourse. And so that I wondered whether that's, I mean, this is just a provocation, that might be a way of framing what you're saying in a way that will help you to develop a more kind of coherent single narrative. But there may well be a single narrative in the written version of the paper, which of course I haven't seen. Joe and Jed and the team, fantastic to hear some more from that project, which I've been an admirer of for a long time. So it's really great. And my question for you is essentially the same question, is that what is the point of your paper? What's its key focus? Is COVID a case study to tell us more about how compliance with perceived law, what is perceived to be the law rather than what is actually the law? And I think that is actually a really important point, which you wisely spent time, you know, you only had 15 minutes, but you spent time elaborating that, because it's not about what the law was, it's about what people thought the law was. And, you know, I tried to read the regulations, and I, been an legal academic for 25 years, it wasn't easy to understand the regulations. And we've probably all had this experience, the lawyers in the room in particular have probably all had this experience of family members contacting us and saying, what can I do? Can I do this? And when you have a family that lives across the whole of the United Kingdom, of course, you've got to deal with 4 different sets of regulations as well. So there's another element there. Or is it more a paper about whether understandings that we have about compliance are robust or stand up when we look at what happened under COVID? Because those are 2 different ways of using your data. And of course, there's a plethora of other different ways of using your data, but I heard both of those in your account, and I wasn't quite sure which of the 2 is. But again, that may be a function of me not having seen the written paper and you only having 15 minutes to present your work. So yes, sorry, very long rambling way of saying, I really enjoyed listening to the fantastic rich data that you have, and a real invitation to both teams to focus the key narrative at the next phase for the project.
Thanks very much, Tammy. I think it's safe to say that the papers perhaps are not written yet, as we have not asked anybody to submit anything necessarily. We wanted this to be a good forum, but I think that these are really rich questions to ask. And I'd love to hear actually from the presenters about this. Sabrina first, though.
Sure. My question is for Valentina and Julia. I have two questions. The first one, I would like to hear a little bit more about the methods out of personal interest on how you analyze the data from the written press and how you went about it. If you wanted to do a systematic analysis of language, or it was kind of more fluid and interpretative, or how did you go about it? And the second one, I wondered, and this is really me being out of my depth and not really knowing all of that much, but have watched all the briefings as well. I'm one of those. I wondered, because you mentioned that men didn't need to hold that expertise necessarily to be in the support role. And is that a representation of the sector? And by this, I don't mean the general comment that we often get on academic panels saying, oh, there's not a lot of women in this sector, that's why we didn't invite one. I mean by that it's a general representation of the injustice or the gender imbalance in that sector. And whether or not it's a question, as Joe mentioned, of credibility. Is it because they think that having that particular man in that position will resonate more with the population, and having that woman in that particular role will resonate more with the population? Thank you. And both amazing presentations. I'm so happy we have all of you contributing to the project. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina. Let's go backwards then. Joe and Jed, would you guys like to comment first?
Feel free to kick off, Joe, if you want.
Okay, so on the clarifying the narrative question, which I guess is the main question for us, yeah, it's absolutely correct to say that there's no such thing as the paper at the moment. This is very much kind of a piece of analysis we're doing and trying to pull together. So I think there's, so at the project level, if I could speak about the project for just a moment, that there's so many different ways to interrogate this that we can actually analyze, look at objective compliance and subjective compliance and various things. We're actually finding that the subjective compliance route is really rich as a line of analysis, because so much of what's come before has been objective compliance analysis, looking at what the rules are, seeing if people comply with them. Whereas this angle that, you know, what people actually think the rules are and seeing if they comply with that, in many ways is more important, because separating out the understanding of the compliance issues is significant in our view. So the narrative for this piece, which we're still certainly trying to pin down, is I think the, and Jed, please do kind of jump in if you think I'm going off piece there, but the narrative is simply that when you take that subjective lens to compliance, you tend to get quite significantly different results when you look at different protected characteristics, for instance, as a centre analysis. And that's something that can help us explain in a different, better way the patterns of compliance that we're seeing compared to the more objective models that we have. Jed, I'm not sure if you want to add.
Yeah, we had a lot of meetings about the subjective-objective distinction, and there were a couple of benefits, I think, or a couple of reasons as to why. I think first, there's something quite acute about COVID-19 and understanding of the regulations, partly for some of the issues I've already been talking about, and the distinctions about what people think is against the law and what people don't. But another thing, I think, in response to Tammy's comments about the focus of the paper, particularly when we're pitching it against other studies of compliance and gender, it is pitched in that sense as being a more COVID-led study, a study of response to the COVID regulations. And that's partly because of the sort of creature that the COVID regulations are, is a sort of unprecedented form of regulatory intervention. But also there is a humongous amount of literature that's already come out on compliance and gender on COVID-19 that's found something quite different using an objective analysis. I gave one study there, but that was really the tip of the iceberg, the Galesso study. There's a lot more that's followed that as well. But I think, just to echo Joe, we are still figuring out the framing a bit. So this has been really, really useful. So thanks.
Thanks both. Valentina, Julia?
Yeah, I'm going to give the methods question to Julia in a second, but just to say, Tammy, I think you've hit the nail on the head when you say I haven't seen the written paper. I do think, I mean, you know, making us think along those lines is very helpful. So thank you. The kind of thread for us is using COVID-19 as yet another case study to show the epistemic injustice, as you say, about the lack of women in positions of knowledge and the consequences that it has for democracy in public life. So I think it's very useful to reflect on the fact that that needs to come through very clearly in the final piece. Very quickly, Sabrina, the representation of gender injustice in the sector, absolutely, but also a somewhat unwillingness to use those experts that do exist, and of which there are many. I mean, we see in academia all the time, right? So yes to both. And I think Julia is much better placed in answering the question about how we analyze the papers.
Yeah, I suppose. So basically, I think there are two parts to our methodology. The first part actually focuses on identifying the speakers of the press conferences. So we went on the government's website with sort of the transcripts of the speakers and of the speeches, really. So we got a good data set already of who was speaking, when they were speaking, partially what they were speaking about as well. And then we also had the speakers standing alongside the main speaker, if that makes sense. So we already have a good set of the women who were speaking in the time frame from March to March. And then how we went about doing the news coverage really is we used LexisNexis, and our search term was the name of the speaker. So for example, Priti Patel. We had a time period, and we looked at press coverages on the day after the press conference, because usually in the newspapers they refer to yesterday at yesterday's conference, Priti Patel was saying this and this. So that's relatively how we were able to gather the data. And yeah, so afterwards we did a linguistic analysis, what kind of language was used. So language of care, dramatic language, emotional language. So for example, they referred to, I think they called it disastrous surge in infections, for example, or they used the word extreme. I think Valentina referred to bogus, something like that, sort of dramatic terms. So the point was mostly so far a linguistic analysis. Potentially we're going to focus on a bit more of the themes, the content. But yeah, those were our preliminary findings and how we went about getting them.
Thank you very much, both. Does anybody else have any questions? Just to clarify about the papers, as Sabrina mentioned at the very beginning, this is a work in progress symposium for our forthcoming BUP edited collection, which is due in 2022. So unfortunately, we will not have any draft papers readily available until a bit further down the line. So the peer reviewers will see them and then hopefully it'll be published, but we will keep you all posted on our Twitter. I wondered if I could maybe abuse my position as chair and ask a couple of questions, or maybe just make some comments. In particular, I wanted to ask Valentina and Julia about your choice of timeline from March to March. So something that struck me was that at the very beginning of the pandemic, it was every single day. And then at some point, and I think it is indeed in your time frame, it stopped being every day, and then it was just whenever there was something important. And I wondered if that if you're going to look at whether that is important and there's a difference in that. I also wanted to ask about tokenism, I suppose, and maybe this is just a general comment. I don't know a huge amount about this, but I remember there was a point, I think it was around when the Black Lives Matter stuff was happening last year, and then it was really at the forefront that it was only white people in the press conferences, and I think Matt Hancock was asked about this, and then he said that slight gaffe where he was like, oh, well, what about Rishi and what about Priti? You know, my ethnic minority friends, and whether I don't know if that was like a turning point at all, and whether that feeds into your analysis. It was just something that kind of occurred to me. And then for Joe and Jed, the spirit of the law thing absolutely jumped out at me when you guys were mentioning the compliance, and I was actually quite surprised to hear, if I'm not mistaken, you were saying that women complied less, and that was quite interesting. And I thought, is this because they admit to it, and then there's other people saying, oh no, I didn't break the law because you know, it didn't do anything wrong, like Dominic Cummings, the famous spirit of the law, you know, person. And I guess that was something that really struck me. And then another thing that came to my head was that another of our discussants in panel number 4, Dr. Sarah Liu, she has written a paper with a colleague of hers about yellow women, as she uses the term, and she says she's reclaiming it. So I know it's a little bit of a questionable one to use, but as a Chinese person myself, I feel like it's okay. And she says that as Chinese women, as yellow women during COVID, when they at the very beginning expressed concern about the virus, fear about the virus, they wore masks way before everyone else, and that's a very Chinese Asian thing to do. They were kind of ridiculed, you know, for this, and so that, I guess that was just something that like struck me as an intersectional thing in your data. I mean, I see Maartje nodding, obviously, as somebody in Singapore. It must be a very different feeling over here where everyone's like, no mask, when Asians love wearing masks anytime, pandemic or not, because of their history of, you know, SARS and everything. But yeah, that's just my comments, basically. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. Also, I'll let, yeah, Valentina, Julia, you might want to comment, yeah.
I mean, thank you. This is all useful stuff. I actually do not have an answer to your questions, but I think they're really useful to think about, and I shall. Oh, my connection is going, I think.
Yeah.
You there?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm here anyway. I think I might have sort of a preliminary answer for you, because my initial impression, this is obviously based on a preliminary analysis rather than in-depth data analysis, but my impression is that the women tend to appear once Boris Johnson fell ill with COVID-19. So it was essentially, well, I wouldn't say a replacement, but they were looking for people to fill the spot. Afterwards, they tended to drop down a little. What's interesting to look at is how sort of the daily to, I don't know, perhaps weekly press conferences, how the time frame is going to affect the presence of women as well. So I think that's definitely something to look at. But yeah, my initial impression is perhaps also because we talked about initial content a little bit as well. So for example, women more used to talk about domestic abuse, child abuse, and so on. So perhaps that's also an influence rather than strictly speaking the time period or time frame. So it's going to be interesting to look at all mixture of factors. So the topic of the conferences, the time period, and whether they were daily press conferences or weekly press conferences happening, and so on.
Thank you. Yes, Joe and Jed. Joe?
Yeah, I can just say something a little bit about the kind of creative, what we're calling creative non-compliance. So the literature on legal compliance is filled with this idea of creative compliance, where companies, people, groups comply with the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And as Jed said earlier, we found quite a lot of evidence, and it relates to the paper we presented here, that during the pandemic, people were often doing the opposite, where they were essentially breaking what they thought to be the law, but complying with the spirit of it. And that's, I think, that's the kind of surface layer. I think the really important thing is why people are practicing creative non-compliance. And there's a whole range of potential reasons. It could be tied to, Jed mentioned earlier, so we'll give the kind of common sense justification. It could be about risk perception, and that factors into different people's decision-making in different ways as well. So I think it's a really interesting point you raised. On the face coverings as well, we did a final survey on face coverings, and we weren't intending to. It was a kind of additional extra, because when those rules were brought in, from our perspective at least, there seems to be quite an unusual reaction, and people started talking about rights violations a lot, and that was really interesting to us. But this idea that, because essentially something was being imposed on kind of your autonomy, there seems to be a bit of a different reaction in the commentary. So we've not quite got around to fully analysing that yet. But one of the things the literature on that does do as well is suggest that those kind of regulations are more readily accepted where there's a history of people using face masks or coverings for various purposes. So it'll be interesting to see that if there was as this episode passes and there's a future instance as well if a similar survey was done in the future in the UK, whether attitudes like that would have changed. But the delay that the UK saw in bringing in those measures, we definitely have, again, still working through the analysis, but there's definitely evidence there that affected compliance to some extent, because people were skeptical of why did we need them a few months ago, and now we suddenly have to allow them.
Yeah, great. If I maybe to make two very brief points, because we haven't got too much time left, just off the back of what Joe was saying. I think this issue of justifications for breaking rules, I think it was definitely the case people understood they had broken the rules, but they're either justifying it as a form of justified breaking, or we're using analogous, which is a bit of a rule bending type conception, which is saying, well, the rules have common sense built in. You see what I mean? It's meant to be analogous for this situation. I think just to touch briefly on the intersectional issues, Adrienne, we've definitely got evidence of that in the qualitative. The issue we've got is our sample size of 47 means we're uncomfortable about drawing things out in relation to, for instance, 3 or 4 participants, which is why we're being led a bit by the quant into what we're exploring in the qual, but we're definitely going to be doing some more work in that area.
Sounds really fascinating. Maartje, do you want to give us the last question for everybody?
Well, it's not so much a question, it's more a quick addition to something that you mentioned and that Joe and Jet then picked up on. So I was, on the one hand, thinking about role modeling as another factor that could affect compliance. But the other thing is the likelihood of getting caught and facing repercussions. So if you constantly bring one of your children to Granny who lives down the road, then it might be unlikely that there is a police officer who is taking the evidence and who is going to bother to even prosecute this, as compared to someone who in broad daylight in the middle of London is breaching the 2-meter rule, etc. So would you really want to make an example out of a woman who feels burdened and is faced with all of these constraints? So I was wondering here, and that picks up on your point about justification, whether you could draw an analogy to the concept of reasonableness and link it to the discussion within equality about who is the appropriate comparator. Because what your analysis so far suggests is that the data seem to complicate that question of identifying the correct comparator. So that might even allow for a longer term impact of your findings beyond COVID. So just wanted to add that as that popped into my head as I was listening to all of you.
Thanks, Maartje. Joe, go on.
So thank you very much for that comment. It's really, really useful. Just on the policing issue, just as something interesting that we're still looking at, which is, I think policing, there's obviously very formal institutional public policing, but this idea that we're trying to test also how people are policed, not just by state authorities, but by the social environment. So we were asking about people in their neighborhood or people in your neighborhood, your friends, and trying to get a sense of how that varied. People as well in private kind of organizations were pretty important, we thought. So we saw that there was similar reactions when you talk about shop workers, policing face covering regulations, for instance. So I think the idea of policing in the pandemic is really a lot more diverse than just a state policing. And if anything, my kind of emerging view from this work is that state policing is much more peripheral than other forms of policing. So if your friends are going to be upset if you breach rules, it's probably going to matter a bit more than if you got told off by a police officer.
Yes, other Joe.
Well, just to pick up on something Valentina said earlier on about the feminist ethics of care, I think care might be something that's worth exploring for both sets of papers in a way, in a bit more detail, because, you know, both papers really brought home the extent to which care is gendered, and, you know, the work that needs to be done on the de-gendering of care in both public and private spheres. So just throwing that out there in case it's useful.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our presentations, all of our discussants, all of our participants. We have reached 12 o'clock in the UK, so it is now lunchtime for us all. We will have 2 more panels this afternoon. We're going to keep the Zoom open, so you can feel free to come out and then come back in if you want to join us later on. But it just leaves me to thank Valentina, Julia, Jed, Joe, Maartje, and Joe Littler for their great interventions and discussions today. We really appreciate everybody, and we hopefully see you back here at 1 o'clock, so in an hour's time. Thank you.
Adrienne, can I thank you and
Valentina
for organising this as well? Thank you. It's been brilliant.
You may, of course, thank us, but we have done nothing.
Thank you also for the very useful feedback and constructive feedback.
It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you all. See you in an hour.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye now.
Bye.